part of what has motivated this shift rightward for people in tech is the perception that the quote-unquote media and the quote-unquote left online dislikes power brokers in tech, and that ostracization has made them look for kind of a new benefactor, look for a new person to hitch their flag to. And I think that they have found, at least first, a lot of support in Trump and J.D. Vance in particular.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We talk about the big invisible forces that threaten to sweep us out past our depth if we're not careful. Reporting on tech is a weird job. Once upon a time, it attracted a kind of upbeat nerd, and frankly, I am that kind of person, or at least I once was. Someone who was sort of interested in technology for its own sake and really was hired to be kind of a booster of that. But in the last few years, as technology has stopped being a niche topic and one that I consider to be a kind of universal language of modern existence, the kind of person that really does this job well turns out to have to be a very hardcore reporter. And that's because these companies have really built a whole infrastructure designed to not only keep journalists away, but also to make the people working inside those companies feel as if they are doing God's work. But clearly, as we're all learning, that's not always the case. And that's why reporters like my guest this week, Paris Martineau, they're doing such important work. And it takes a dogged reporter like her to get inside these companies and understand what they are all about. In this conversation, we talk about everything from what it is to try to be a journalist and maintain your objectivity, all the way through to what it is for her to cultivate these sources, because she has single-handedly reported on stories that have, blown up entire companies. She is a fascinating interview. I hope you enjoyed this hour-long conversation with Paris Martineau. Paris Martineau, thank you so much for being on The Rip Current.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I was just telling this story about when I first got hired at NBC News. I had this interview where the president at the time basically said, we are all good on covering the Hill and Pentagon and Congress and the rest of it, but we don't know what's going on in Silicon Valley or what's happening. And I tried to explain to him, as I then went on to explain to people throughout my time at NBC, how hard it is to do the job that you do and that I try to do, which is get inside these companies and get them to talk to you. If you were going to explain to the head of a news organization what it takes and why it is so hard to get sourced in tech, can you tell us a little about that? Why is the job so hard of getting inside such that people want to tell you things in secret from inside tech companies?
Well, I think this simple answer is they hate us. More so than, one can extrapolate that a lot of people in politics and various walks of life have an antagonistic relationship with the press. However, over the last, I was going to say couple of years, but it's really been a movement that we've seen over the last decade. People in Silicon Valley have grown increasingly antagonistic towards the media. And it has become almost, for a certain class of person in Silicon Valley, kind of a rallying cry or group identifier that you're like, F the press in some ways. And all these journalists are liars. And so that level of antagonism and that strange kind of cultural adherence to a worldview where journalists are some malevolent force makes it extraordinarily difficult to source up in the valley. Because I think one thing that people don't realize that aren't in journalism is a big part of our job, or at least my own personal approach to it, is trying to suss out why someone would talk to me. And the reasons for that are multifaceted. Let's explain that.
Exactly. Because who knows? They have many, many reasons for.
They could have many, many reasons. The most basic version of this, I think, is people like to feel important or heard, if we're going to simplify it. But in the case of something like DC politics, they might view somebody working at a senator's office might view the press as a tool to take down an enemy or
That's
reveal some sort of information about someone else that they don't want out there that could help their boss or them like rise in the eyes of all the people who read the same newswire and news sites, which is their colleagues. That gets a bit more complicated.
You're trying to raise you're trying to get a journalist to articulate something that you can't articulate inside your Senate office or your whatever it is. That's exactly right. You're using us to leverage something you don't have the power to get out there. Typically, that makes a lot of sense. That's right.
And I mean that's a transactional part of the job, but that is a part of the job that has existed since like the invention of journalism.
Right.
And in a DC and political space, that is very clear. There are a handful of publications that all these people read and they know can influence their coworkers or bosses in certain ways. And so that, while it is certainly frowned upon in polite society to be leaking to journalists, you know that everyone is doing it. And people
I would actually
do it.
I would actually argue that if anything, it's actually kind of a mark of distinction to have a relationship with journalists. It's kind of considered. This is why, Jeffrey Goldberg's showing up in a Signal chat on the one hand is astounding, but it's astoundingly stupid that they included. It's so astoundingly stupid. But you also can understand, like he's got the cell number of a bunch of those people because that is sort of the expected thing in his world and in Washington. I would say it's not just that he's a wonderfully sourced journalist, and he does a great job, but it is also, I would say, culturally expected that if you're in Washington, you should have a relationship with a handful of journalists to do exactly the kind of thing that you're saying people use journalists to do.
And I think Jeffrey Goldberg is a good example of this because he's like famous among journalists in the DC circuit for being really good at that. He is the sort of person that's going up and introducing himself at these parties to every single person and then introducing those people to other people. He is famous for getting his name out there in a way that would lead to something like this happening, although obviously no one could have predicted it.
Right.
On the other page, tech is a much newer industry, and it's an industry that is, in its modern era, defined by hype cycles that don't do well with scrutiny. It is defined by kind of the era of the press release announcing you've just raised how many hundreds of millions of dollars for your Series C or something. And that is a industry and a mode of operation that doesn't intrinsically have a need for leaking something to the press because frankly, if you were any details revealed about your business are probably going to result in more scrutiny of the reason why you just got all that money and the promises you're making and have very little upside. So it's
I wonder if in your career you've had the same experience I have, which is that I was taught early on, or the expectation early on was that I would be a hype person, that I would be, especially when I moved from magazines into television, when I first would introduce myself to public relations people at these companies and say, I'm going to be the correspondent for, Al Jazeera, NBC, whoever it was, there's a lot of excitement because they say, fantastic, we've got these cool robots we can show you, and you can, we've got some really awesome, visual stories about whatever X, Y, and Z. And there's this clear expectation that you're going to be what was the standard, which was this kind of upbeat enthusiast. And there's a whole ecosystem, I would argue, among, these vloggers and TikTok people and so forth, of being a kind of booster, right? An excited, almost sort of hyper consumer as a quote unquote journalist, right? Whereas then when I said to them, no, actually, I'm trying to understand better, how you're,
how do you make money?
How you make money, or
how does this impact the world?
Yeah, the privacy trade-off or whatever. Once I got into those kinds of questions, suddenly I remember having lunch with this one person who said, my job, I had been basically trying to get through it to get into this one company, this big company, over and over again. And the comms person assigned to me on our like third or fourth lunch or something, where I'm trying to make some headway, she finally says to me, because she's just irritated, she's like, my job is to just keep you away from us, right? Like the job is just to keep you at a distance. I'm letting you in is not my job, and facilitating that's not my job. I'm trying to keep you away. And I was like, oh wow, thank you so much for letting me know that, so I don't have to waste my time anymore. And from then on, I realized, oh, that's really what's happening here, as opposed to the transactional thing that you're talking about in DC.
No, and I mean, I think that this is those two different categories. It's a shift that has happened over the last like 2 decades that is responsible for how default antagonistic a lot of the people working in tech are towards the press. Because in the 2000s, in the early and mid 2010s, a lot of tech journalism was this kind of boosterist, oh, look at these cool, smart boys in their dorm room creating the next super app sort of journalism. And there's certainly merits to that. You know, like some of those stories were fantastic. Some of them were good. Some of them were a bit misconceived, but it was a nascent industry. And there was a whole class of journalists that for a very long time, their job was to be like, wow, look at what's going on with these neat tech boys, usually, because they was rarely tech girls.
Yeah, no, that's
but
right. Still
as the industry, I mean, still the case. As the industry matured and got more and more market dominance, and there were more journalists out there covering tech, it started to flip a bit. And people were like, actually, maybe we should scrutinize this more. I mean, I think the biggest turning point of this was around the Cambridge Analytica stuff in the mid 2010s. But suddenly the coverage of tech as an industry stopped being almost exclusively, hey, look at this cool thing, and what are the ramifications of this thing that has matured into a product that millions or billions of people use. And that started to upset people who were like, wait, what about our great coverage?
Right. Look, we're making the world better through whatever this thing is. That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I would always point out to people around me, especially when I had like a new colleague who didn't have a lot, was a good general assignment kind of investigative journalist, but was not necessarily familiar with tech, I would have to sort of explain like the culture of the antagonism that you're talking about, and how it's not just, it's not just cultural, it's institutional, and that there is, from the very top down, there is this attitude that speaking to anyone outside of our company is the worst possible thing you could possibly do. And if you do it, you will be, outcast, not just from this company, but from the industry. Your reputation will be ruined. And then you also had, at these big companies, you have there's a whole administrative layer whose job it is, typically in the sort of HR/people and culture department, to keep people working at those companies utterly convinced that what they're doing is making the world better. Because it was so important in recruiting young people that they feel a sense of purpose and the rest of it. And so, as I was sort of trying to explain to people the difference, like the president of NBC, like the difference between reporting on getting a congressional staffer to speak to you and getting a product manager at Facebook to speak to you, is that product manager at Facebook, the congressional staffer hates his boss, is underpaid and overworked, and tends to think he would do the job better. Whereas the product manager at Facebook, she believes in the product.
She's making $500K or something like that.
Way more money than I will ever make. That's right. So she's certainly not underpaid. She's being told every day that her job is making the world better, and she has tremendous admiration for the people above her. Now, this, of course, as we read books like Sarah Wynne Williams and these new Careless People, that the meta memoir, for anybody who hasn't read it, it's an amazing tell-all book. These kinds of things. It's becoming clear that people inside those companies are more and more dissatisfied, and I would say that is part of how, that's an opening for journalists to figure some stuff out. But gosh, that difference between the old school way of getting inside with someone in DC or in the Pentagon or whatever, and this category of person is so different. And their work is making such a huge difference in the world, it seems to me, which is why what you do is so important.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the satisfaction and contentness aspect is a huge part of it. I mean, for a long time, the main coverage of companies like Google would be about how incredible their benefits are, and employees can get as many
Look at all the
massages a
snacks.
day as they want. They can have 3-course meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and all of this stuff. And basically, you'd live your entire life within this ecosystem. And it is a significantly more difficult entire enterprise to convince someone like that to tell you things they shouldn't about a company. And in most cases, when you're talking to somebody like this, it's going to result in a better story if they have some sort of sense of there's something wrong going on here. And people are more likely to identify something going wrong if they're already dissatisfied or have some sort of awareness that something is not right there, which is is less likely to happen when they are on the massage table 3 times.
Yeah, that's right. I will say also, before and after the break, I want to ask you a little bit about sort of how you have specifically gotten someone to speak to you, or what that relationship winds up being like. But before we get there, I mean, I think another thing that's interesting, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, is the degree to which is just how often you meet people in the communications, typically department of a big company, who did time in the Obama administration. For me, it is really interesting. I don't know. Have you ever bumped into that very often?
Yeah, Jay Carney of Amazon. The Obama administration has its little fingers in every place.
It's really amazing. And one of the things that people, I think, don't maybe not remember about the Obama administration is that while on the one hand they were tremendously, they were politically progressive in a lot of ways. My grandma, a diehard liberal, would say that they were not progressive enough, but they were progressive in a lot of ways. They were not particularly progressive when it came to being communicative with the press. And that was the rise of a tactic in which you had a background briefing, in which you were no longer, in order to get the information that you needed from them. And this is, so here's how it looks in tech, is I'll go to a company for comment. I'll have a story about them that they presumably won't like. And they say, and I say, I'd like to talk to you. Can we arrange an interview with an executive, or, can I get comment in some way? And more, my expectations are very low as to what they're going to come back with. But what they tend to do is they then say, what's your deadline? And you say, so
whatever.
you say whatever. And then they play with time up until the last second. A friend of mine, who used to be on the inside of one of these operations, said that that's the number one tactic, is you push someone up against their deadline as much as you possibly can, so they don't have any time to maneuver. And they say, can I get you on the phone for a quick background briefing? Whereupon they get you on for an hour, and the agreement in that conversation is supposed to be that you're not allowed to use anything they tell you. They just get to spin you for an hour. And for a long time, I would have these fights with the standards departments at the places that I've worked, where I would say, I don't think I should be accepting these. And they'd say, no, you have an obligation to listen to what this company has to say. And I'm saying, but I should not be entering into a conspiracy with this company against the audience.
Yeah.
Where I'm keeping it from them there. And there's this, so you wind up in this weird situation. So my policy since, for many years now has been, I don't do those kinds of briefings. I say, no, I'd be happy to take what you have on the record.
Smart. Because then that same spokesperson that told you all of this, sometimes rarely pertinent information about the story, will then get mad that it's not reflected in the story. And I'm like, how is it supposed to be? You asked for this to be off the record.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which is clear that and what I was told by this friend of mine who used to work at inside one of these operations is, you are specifically rewarded for either turning a story or getting a story killed by convincing the reporter in that background briefing that it's not a worthwhile thing to pursue.
And in the case of companies like Amazon, which has a huge press organization, like hundreds of people, if not at its peak, like 1,000 plus, they would get rewarded internally based on the number of corrections they could obtain to stories. So in some ways that incentivizes them to not participate when you reach out before publication to be like, hey, wanted to run through this. Is there anything you want to comment on? Any inaccuracies? They'll be like, no comment. And then as soon as you hit publish, they're like, actually, I think these 3 things are wrong and this is why. And it's because they want to hit their corrections quota.
Wow.
Obviously, this has changed a little bit over the last couple of years as the team has morphed. But I remember doing a story about specifically the insane PR spin machine that Amazon operates, just because it was baffling to me. And it seemed baffling to a lot of the PR people who worked there or continue to work there, that this was the way they were choosing to operate, not to get like things right when they go out the door, but to undermine the trust in the press afterwards.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think it's smart. I mean, if I'm just being purely mercenary, sort of outcome oriented about it, I would say, yeah, it's smart because you're creating both a credibility problem for the press, and you're creating fear in the reporter about dealing with Amazon, even approaching them, so that the prospect of reporting on them becomes stressful. I think is actually a very
it's a deviously smart tactic. And what's been interesting about covering tech is, I mean, sometimes there'll be obviously like good PR people that work with a company or a decent PR operation, but increasingly over the time I was covering, I've started to see more and more of like the Amazonian tactics, but cranked up to an 11 in terms of hostility, where someone's entire operation is basically they come in as a crisis PR person, and their job clearly is to make the reporters and editors on this story's lives a living nightmare in every way, so that no one will ever think about reporting on their company in that way again.
Right.
And I mean,
that's right.
I guess it does work. Because then afterwards you have conversations with editors where they're like, yeah, that was a lot of effort that we had to spend on that story and a lot of back and forth. We probably shouldn't do that again unless we have something really juicy. And it's like, I don't think we should be rewarding these companies for doing stuff like that.
Yeah. When we come back, we'll talk about how a reporter like Paris goes in with a source, and then how the culture of tech has changed as people's eyes have, I would argue, opened to the sorts of unintentional effects that products are having. Stay with us. Okay, so Paris, without giving away anything, don't give away any names, don't give any companies. Of course, you wouldn't, but just so we say it, give me a sense of what it is. Give us a sense of what it is to actually make a connection. What is what is it like to have that sort of relationship with someone? And how have you typically been able to do that?
It's very interesting. I mean, the easiest way to go about it is like someone reaches out with a tip, which is always great. And that's a jumping off point to then kind of make a further connection. The hardest one is blind approaches. Whenever you've kind of got a story that you're working on and you have specific anecdotes or details that you need to confirm, something I do with all of my sources is typically like, once we're really talking about something and maybe our conversation is ending and I'm looking to maybe get more people to corroborate it, I will often ask, like, is there anybody else that you think I should be reaching out to about this, or anybody who might know something interesting? I obviously won't tell them that we spoke, won't even mention it, but just any names that come to mind. And those people seem to have a higher hit rate in terms of cold reaches. But part of this process is you have to cast kind of a wide net in terms of looking for people in the right place within companies that could know something. Often in practical matters, if it's, I will use like LinkedIn's sales navigator function, because then you can specifically look for people that worked at a company in a certain time, have these words in their bio, and then kind of go through that and make a list of 50 or 100 potential people, and then reach out to all of them in ways that I think might work for that specific person. And it is totally, I've often tried to explain to people, it is like sales. It is a numbers very
game
much like
in
sales.
The way that sales is that way, because there is and why news organizations don't use more, Salesforce style CRMs, right? These sort of, these systems for keeping track of these people, because there's hundreds of people that you have to try before you're going to get a lead in the same way. There's a reason that salespeople call it a lead in the same way that we do. So yeah, that is really interesting. The patience and it
really requires just a lot of phone calls or texts or emails or whatever way you're doing it, with a lot of different people and a lot of rejection until you get a small handful of yeses. And then of course comes the difficult part of getting these people on the phone or meeting up for a coffee or something like that and trying to win their trust. And I don't know, it's the difficult part, but I think it is also the easiest part in a way, because that's kind of the core of our job, is to be good at these first and early impressions. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
getting somebody on the phone or to meet up with you is like more than half the battle usually.
Yeah, that's right. Once you're there, I feel that way as well. Also, because I feel like at that point, they wouldn't even go that far unless they were willing or, interested in some form in speaking to you. So for you, I'm curious how you found their motivations and what it tends to be and the kinds of conversations that you wind up having with them as a result. Like for me, I don't very often bump into anyone who's just out and out, hostile to the organization. I would say that one of the conversations that I wind up having a lot is with people who feel that something is deeply misunderstood about the work that the organization is doing and wants a journalist to correct that to help correct that, which is a funny sort of, it's like, it's a true believer kind of instinct, but you can sense that they're grappling with something, because they can sense that the public perception of this is very negative, but what we're doing is quite positive. I just want to clear the air a little bit, is sort of the way some people will speak to me about it. And to me, that feels like a place where I'm realizing, I'm sensing in that person, oh, well, if the public is responding to this so negatively, they must have it wrong. But then you slowly see that person get to, oh, maybe I have this wrong in
It's a
some
little
way.
bit like doing a therapy session in some way.
Yeah.
Because I mean, a big part of it is trying to suss out what is this person's motivations. There is certainly a category of person that you often see, like in their maybe response to whatever your initial outreach is, they do bring up like, oh, I think you guys have this wrong. Maybe I don't want to talk to you. And then the correct response or counter in that is like, oh, I didn't realize we had something wrong. Like, I'd love to understand more.
Teach me.
Teach me. And a lot of people are motivated by like the teaching impulse, that they want to help you understand something that is either misunderstood publicly or that they think they have more specialized knowledge about, which of course they do. I know nothing. And they're interested in helping you unravel something. There's also people who, I don't know, are just interested in the idea of talking to a journalist and figuring out what's going on. There are also people who feel like there's something wrong going on, or have maybe heard about like what you're working on and want to help in some way because they think that there is merit to what you're doing. I think that they're often the best kind of source is someone who reaches out to you because they'd heard from someone else that you're doing something. And those people end up often being quite well placed.
And do you find that there is a shift going on in the culture of people who work in tech? Do you notice a shift at all? I feel like I'm seeing people who that it used to be a very diehard culture about believing in the thing. And now, as we're entering this era of layoffs and, all kinds of uncertainty of, that people are they're a little less naive than they used to be, and a little more critical of their own company, their own industry than they used to be. Does that sound for you?
I mean, I think it takes a couple forms. You'll sometimes have the people who, rather than viewing their workplace like a utopian family, like people might have thought about it 10, 15 years ago, they view it as a job and have a kind of clear and cogent view of the positives and negatives of it and are willing to speak on both. You also, interestingly, something I've noticed a lot over the last like 5 or so years is there's this emergence of like a disillusioned class, like a group of people who joined one of these companies that was pitched to them about changing the world or changing whatever industry or doing some great good. And they earnestly bought into that. They earnestly went there expecting to make change in the way that the company was pitching itself. And then over the years have become really disillusioned once they have seen the reality of what the company is doing or how it is not living up to its expectations, or that they've seen coworkers who hold similar ideals be stymied by, strange bureaucracies. And those people end up being very valuable sources because they deeply care about the work they're doing, are incredibly engaged, and have an understanding of the company's mission, but they see the gaps in between the mission and the reality.
I've seen, in your work, you have, your investigations have, I mean, you have made, it seems to me, like when I think of your work, I think about looking at companies where, real mismanagement is going on. I tend to do things about the unintended effects that a product ends up having on kids or whatever else. I feel like I've seen in your work, you do a wide variety of things, but one thing I've really seen in your work that I think is really hard to do is figuring out places where a company is being mismanaged. And under your investigations have, I don't know if I think it's fair to say resulted in, or at least, correlated to the firing of CEOs, fraud, you've uncovered fraud. Like, tell us a little bit about that, just so we get sort of acclimated with your body of work and how you go about figuring that stuff out. Like, you've gone at a lot of different companies that have clearly made a bunch of promises that they couldn't deliver, and then the whole thing kind of unravels.
Yeah, like over the past 5 to 7 years, I kind of came upon figured out a niche for myself in companies that are, I guess you could call it corporate accountability journalism at its like most basic. But I started to, I'm really motivated by stories where tech companies or businesses that perhaps seem a bit ephemeral or abstruse end up having a real world consequences on people, be it their employees or their customers or the world in which they work. This kind of started originally because when I came to the information, my last employer, I was put on the Amazon beat, and it was my first time doing a hard corporate beat. And I was a little bit, like, oh boy, this seems like it could be a bit boring, but I ended up carving out kind of a niche this was around the time that it was during the middle of the pandemic, and Amazon was expanding rapidly its physical delivery presence, and in part an area called the middle mile, which is like trucking, their trucking operations. And I started to think, like, what would be the actual impact on people with this? And I ended up doing kind of my first big investigation there, which was looking at the human toll of Amazon's rapid expansion in trucking and kind of the increased number of deaths or serious injuries that resulted in kind of applying Amazonian practices of speed and efficiency over all else to a large, many-ton vehicles driven by sleepy adults. And this led to me spending kind of like the last 5 years on kind of a roving investigative and features beat with just a broader focus. And the niche I ended up finding was examples of startups and different kind of nascent tech companies that have received, all of a sudden some founder with an idea gets tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, grows a company rapidly, and what are the unintended consequences of the mismanagement of that?
Yeah.
And the consequences can often be great. I mean, I did this story on one startup that kind of did a Uber for nurses like product, where essentially it was a gig work platform for nurses so that hospitals and different medical providers could tap in to a network of allegedly kind of credentialed nurses if they need extra labor. This really took off during the pandemic. And the story I ended up doing was about how it all fell apart.
So when we come back, we're going to get into that investigation and into the broader question of VC-backed companies and whether that whole business model is in some way leading to the kind of fraud that Paris has uncovered. We'll be right back. When we had our very first guest on this podcast, it was Catherine Bracey, who wrote a book called World Eaters, How Venture Capital is Cannibalizing the Economy. And so much of her thesis jives for me with what you're talking about with this nursing platform that you mentioned. I should say here, my mom is a nurse. She was a nurse my whole life, ran a nursing school. And so I have a real soft spot for nurses. So when I think about Uberizing nurses, it makes me nuts. But I want to tell us more about that investigation. And then I want to talk about the role of VC in how this stuff goes wrong.
So, I mean, what I ended up finding was that the kind of core promise of the platform, that they would offer a pool of credentialed, qualified, checked nurses to hospitals to be able to tap on when they see fit, was kind of a lie. I had a person on the record who was in charge of kind of their legal and compliance office operations at this company, who essentially blew the whistle and was like, I was horrified working there because the CEO and founder essentially would come into meetings and be like, I don't really care how we're credentialing people. We could have homeless people on the platform for all I care. We just need to be putting bodies in hospitals so that we can grow as fast as possible. And it was a story basically about how this obsession with rising to meet the demand of the pandemic and growing as rapidly as its investors wanted them to resulted in people with criminal records or people without the proper qualifications getting put in medical settings and having kind of disastrous implications for patient care.
And what was the outcome of that investigation? What happened at the end?
Before the investigation published, when we reached out for them for comment, the CEO resigned.
Wow.
And then the new CEO implemented, after the investigation published, a bunch of kind of new policies around this specific thing.
I mean, you guys, just so everybody's, well, this is why we have journalists. We need journalists in the world, you people. Okay, so let's talk about, you mentioned that this was in part because trying to rise to meet the demand of investors. And so Catherine Bracey, who I had on before, her whole thesis is that that venture capital, which was, you know, invented to fill this particular financing need in speculative software, you know, typically hardware back in the day, stuff that banks didn't even know how to assess, has now morphed into this world-eating organism that's being applied to things like, and she literally says the same thing, Uberization of whatever. Housing, food, you know, and in the case of this story, nurses. And I wonder if sort of what you think about what it is about venture, you know, do you lay the blame? I mean, obviously the blame falls at the feet of that CEO, but that CEO is clearly under some sort of pressure that caused him to, you know, make some really bad choices here. And I wonder what you think of that thesis.
No, I think, I mean, it's hard to say where the blame lies in anything, but I think venture capital is undoubtedly an accelerant in the good and the bad. And the bad has quite extreme consequences that I don't think that the industry is really reckoning with. The kind of whole conceit of this is you are a founder, you have an idea, you have to pitch what that idea could be at its maximum potential, that in order to get hundreds of millions of dollars, you can't just say, I want to make a reasonable business that grows at a reasonable rate and has reasonable profits. You have to be pitching a business that will have exponential growth and be the next big thing, and everyone will be using it. And that is not a business, that is not a business outcome that is going to apply to the vast majority of business ideas. And so trying to make those two things meet one another means that there's often kind of a push or people often have kind of an impetus for fudging a bit or trying to make their business. The incentives are a little misaligned with the reality.
Yeah, I really, and I find that I hear anecdotally from people, from founders who try to dance this dance with venture backers, that they, you know, I was talking to a guy the other day who's trying to create a without giving it away, how do I describe his company? He's trying to create something that is helpful when it comes to mental health, let's say. And one thing that he's been bumping into is that when he goes and talks to VCs about it, those VCs are much more interested in whether they can use his expertise in mental health to better understand and control the market, the user, than they are in him trying to benefit the user through the mental health knowledge he has, if that makes sense. So like he says that there's almost sort of, and I've heard this from other people, that there's a reluctance on the part of VCs to bring in a founder who's got a larger desire for benefiting the customer, if there's any indication that might slow down the growth of the company, or that he might as well not be willing to do what's needed to grow it as fast as possible.
Yeah, I mean, this mindset of achieving growth at any cost is pervasive among the tech industry. And it is pervasive because it is, if you ask VCs, it's a necessary cost of doing business. Why else are they giving this person tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, if not to hit growth goals? And hopefully see that company could be the one that helps them earn back their investment in all the other companies. It, I guess, makes sense from a logical perspective, but the outcomes that you get from having that incentive structure applied to a wide variety of companies, it's a bit wonky, to say the least. It's a bit unfortunate.
I agree with you. So when this is a sort of a curveball here, but people often say to me, because my job is so much about being critical of tech, they say, God, you must hate. It's funny. I get one or the other. I either get people saying, God, you must love tech. You must be so interested. You must be a total sort of tech nerd. And I'm like, no, man, I'm a very 19th century person otherwise. Or they say, God, you must hate it all and want to go back to the 19th century. And I go, no, I don't want that either. Do you know what dentistry was like in the 19th century? No, thank you.
I need my AC.
Yeah, I really like, there's a lot of things I really like about the antibiotics and so forth that we have right now. But I'm curious for you, do you find yourself like, is there a portion of technology that you are excited about, glad about, optimistic about, that you that is in part how you do what you do, why you do what you do? Is there a defending a certain category of tech or innovation or so forth? I don't know. Like for you, what are you positive about in this sector?
It's a fun question because
I don't know. We don't get this a lot.
In all time, I try to be, because the nature of my work is to be skeptical and find things that are wrong about the world. I'm generally hesitant in my day-to-day life, even outside of work, about being unabashedly positive about things, because I am constantly filled with a secret feeling of dread that everything at one point will reveal itself to be hot garbage. So I think that's, I don't know, an interesting question. I enjoy what tech do I enjoy? I mean, I enjoy tech generally. I like using tech. I've got an iPhone. I've got fun headphones. I enjoy, one thing that I'm excited about in, I guess, the AI space is, for a long time this is a small example, but I've used Trint, the auto transcriptions website, to do transcriptions for interviews and stuff I record. Just because I like having kind of the notes for my calls and being able to make sure I'm quoting somebody accurately. But the pricing for it had gotten outrageous, and it was also kind of a clumsy software. In the last year, I discovered this new thing called Mac Whisper, which basically uses WhisperKit and other transcription-based AI models locally on your computer. You pay just once a lifetime fee, and then you can have local transcriptions that don't go to the cloud of any of your sensitive conversations. It's incredibly accurate, and that's been a real delight for me. It's one of the few AI products that I unabashedly love, because I mean, it does everything I want, and it's pretty convenient.
I love that. I would say the one for me that's really been blowing my mind recently is Stanford put out a thing called Storm. It is a research tool. And for me, it's like, my whole thesis is give the AI to the scientists. I have a piece about this at recurrent.com where it's just give it to the scientists. Let them play with it. Let's stop giving it to people who can make money off it. Let's stop making fake girlfriends out of it and so forth. Let's give it to the scientists. And Stanford has this thing called Storm that is a research paper generator. It's incredible. Ooh. You say, just what did I hit it with the other day? It was like, what's the correlation between basically it was income inequality in the United States, and is technology making income inequality worse? And you can just ask it that question. Is income inequality getting worse in the United States, and is technology to blame? And then it'll generate a peer-reviewed style article summarizing the latest findings on that. In the old days, as a science journalist, you got to call, all the top people, and you still have to, let's be clear, you still have to do this, but you had to call the top people and say, what papers have you seen recently that you're into? In this case, it's this way of saying, oh, here is the most recent stuff on this stuff. And they've done a very good job of keeping it from hallucinating the
That's fascinating.
The paper, and really what it is I more or less ignore what the AI writes as a summary because it can mischaracterize the findings, but the actual papers,
but the links,
oh my god, it's so great. And then you can call those authors and say, hey, what's going on, blah, blah, blah.
I literally am bookmarking that
it's
now.
a good one.
That's
it's a good
fantastic
one. But again,
like
no one's making money off that. No one's making money that way, and this is the thing that I am always saying is like let's give it to the people who don't make money for a while.
Yes. And I mean, I think that is the simple answer of what I'm actually excited about. Is I'm excited about the application of AI or any of these new technologies into making simple parts of our everyday life in searching a little bit easier. I don't really ascribe to the accelerationist belief that it's going to radically transform everything and make everything better and perfect, and we're never going to have to work again. I think it's going to probably, in the best use cases, make a lot of things a little bit better. And that's cool and exciting.
That's
and,
right.
Yeah. I just prefer that we didn't have to spend, I think it seems a bit short-sighted to spend all of the venture capital money on one product category idea.
And restart nuclear power to make it all happen. That's I know. I feel the same way.
Great.
When we come back in our final block, we're going to talk about what it's like to watch the people who've come through the culture that Paris covers now basically running the country. So stay with us. Okay, so you undoubtedly watched or listened to Mark Andreessen's articulation to Ross Douthat, I think is how you say it, at the New York Times, his articulation of the deal, which once upon a time he believed was in effect between tech and power brokers in Washington, basically tech and DC. And what Andreessen goes on to say in this interview is basically, we had a deal in which you left us alone and praised us for our work. And in exchange, we kept making magical, amazing technology. And then the Biden administration, according to him, broke that deal. And that's part of why Andreessen decided to align himself with Trump. And to me, I just wonder what it's like for you to watch these people who have risen through the culture that you and I have been talking about in this hour, right? They've risen through this world in which you are constantly told that the work you're doing is amazing. You're constantly told to be secretive about it. You're constantly sort of believing in the kind of meritocracy that has pushed the leadership to the very top, and you're totally convinced that no one else can understand the work you're doing. Those people now, for me, watching those people, be in the White House, be at Mar-a-Lago, guys like David Sachs, guys like Elon Musk, suddenly having the president on the phone all the time. What's it like to what do you think they're like, help us understand the worldview. Like, what do those guys want? And why do you think they are up there, in those meetings?
Want to have as few limits as possible on their business operations and the places from which they derive capital and revenue. I think that it's interesting you mentioned Mark Andreessen, because Andreessen Horowitz is perhaps the number one example of when I said tech people hate us, journalists. Andreessen Horowitz, I think, is the number. Like, legitimately, it is from the top down. Normally, when you're talking about like people in tech hating, you might mean like some of the top executives. Almost every single human being that works at Andreessen Horowitz hates tech journalists as much as humanly possible. Like, it's a level of like icing out that is honestly baffling, because as much as you can dislike tech journalists personally, there are some times that if you're a smart person, it makes sense to try and spin the story by picking up the call when someone asks, like, for your comment on this. Like, it just seems in your best interest. I think that part of what has motivated, I mean, this is just me spitballing, but I would imagine that part of what has motivated this shift rightward for people in tech is the perception that the quote-unquote media and the quote-unquote left online dislikes power brokers in tech, and that ostracization, which often, for many of these people, that plays out in terms of people on Twitter being mean to them, is what they're talking about. That kind of antagonistic relationship they are perceiving in people that used to be their biggest boosters has made them look for kind of a new benefactor, look for a new person to hitch their flag to. And I think that they have found, at least first, a lot of support in Trump and J.D. Vance in particular, and saw the Trump administration as a good opportunity to increase the size of their portfolios and enshrine a new anti-regulatory apparatus in the halls of the U.S. government.
We at NBC we covered the efforts of Peter Thiel to build his own candidates, to Frankenstein his own candidates, and the one we focused on was Blake Masters, who was the other J.D. Vance, right? And at the time, there was this, what we were looking at was, isn't it crazy that there's this kind of American oligarch class that is emerging that really is not just sitting back, but is, actively investing in trying to get into politics. But at the time we naively were like, because Blake Masters lost, it just looked as if, this isn't paying off. It didn't, that
all it takes is one.
Turns out you just need one. And the bet that Peter Thiel made wound up paying off in this incredible way, such that he truly has a former employee, or at least a former founder that took his money in the White House, and to see that strategic effort directly lead into the halls of power like this has been so interesting. Because the thing that I, for anyone who doesn't sort of follow this world closely, one of the themes that I keep seeing in it is this desire, like you say, to just clear all of this regulatory mishigas out of the way so that we can do the thing that we were put on earth to do, which is create this incredible stuff. I have a friend who says that people at the top of Silicon Valley are like the friends from high school who watched Akira and are a little too excited about it, don't quite understand what it's trying to tell you, that it's not just about how cool Tetsuo's powers are. It's actually about the screaming people in the background who get affected by it, and Tokyo getting destroyed, and why that's bad.
But those powers, man, they're so cool.
That's right, exactly. And that thing of, and I feel like we are suddenly the people, who once upon a time cast themselves as like, we're improving the world and we're all about making life better for everybody. More and more, there's this feeling of like, like you see Sam Altman and others talking about trying to create these like techno cities. Elon Musk just got permission the other day from the southern Texas town that to build a SpaceX city. In that place, there's this real sense of trying to create a walled garden.
I think it's also about creating a legacy. I think that part of it, this is obviously just, again, my own thoughts on the matter.
You've been in this a long time.
I can imagine that, like, you come up in the tech industry where everyone is telling you you are the most brilliant genius that is changing the world. They love what you do. They think you are an absolute world changer, remaking the world in your image. Then you go into this period where everyone is suddenly mad at you and says that you are hurting the world and making things worse, and that the effects of your products the harm is immeasurable, and that doesn't quite sit right for you, because everyone assumes that no one assumes that they're the bad guy, and it's very difficult to ever believe that you are the bad guy. And suddenly you are looking for a way, well, how do I prove not only that I'm the good guy, but make sure that is enshrined in the future in some way? How do I build a city that will be remembered for decades and hundreds of years to come? How do I make a lasting impact on American politics that will be written about in the history books? How do I get in images with the president or go to the inauguration in a way that paints me as backing the right horse? I think a lot of it is about managing your reputation and kind of cultivating your legacy.
I really think that really jives with the kind of thing that we were talking about earlier about why sources speak to you. It's, that category of person who says, I just think we've been misunderstood, and I'll talk to you in order to sort of clear, to get the idea across. I think that is so interesting. And, and the thing that I think is concerning about that from a a political perspective is like, that's not a terribly democratic attitude. You know, that's not a sitting in the meeting and hashing it out together kind of attitude. That's a, I'm going to tell you what's going on
what
attitude.
people are forgetting is that politics is hard work in its most pure form. You're supposed to be like, you are serving a nation. You are representing the interests of your constituents and doing a lot of work in order to make the nation a better place in some way. And that involves a level of humility and dedication to a cause and friction and the ability to sit there and actually dig through all the documents and figure out, all right, other people have tried this before. Maybe some of them were right, maybe some of them were wrong. Let's figure out what is the best thing for us to do here. And that's a lot harder than just saying everyone is stupid and I'm actually the smartest. And we're just
by the end of this quarter, we're getting it done. That's right. The way
it's
that
gonna
I
be,
say.
no one has ever thought of it like I did. And so it's going to be perfect whenever I try it. And that's just not a intelligent way to go about something.
I like to think that something about this shift that you've been articulating here, in which people are seeing the mythology of tech in a new way, even when they've made their career in tech. I like to believe that there's a sort of maturing going on the part that you know, that's reflected in those people's experience, that maybe will down the line give us some sense. You know, my thesis has always been, we don't really understand ourselves as well as we want to, or as well as we think we do. And I feel like we're coming to grips with that in this new way, that at its worst, I see people say, well, you know, to sort of despair of humans, you know, from inside tech. I've had people have that kind of reaction. But I like to think, I don't know, do you think there's any silver lining to the idea that we're sort of becoming more conscious that democracy is hard and slow and full of friction, like you know, all of these things that you say? Are we going to get better at this, in your view?
I hope so. I worry that because of the volume of things that are happening on a day-to-day basis for the average news consumer or person involved in these issues, that it is overwhelming. And that the nature of social media and online engagement makes it easier to ascribe to kind of black and white. Like, this is either all bad or this idea is all good, and there's very little in the middle. And I worry that that is going to make it harder to come to that conclusion, that democracy is difficult, it is flawed, but it is ultimately a concept worth pursuing, and it takes a lot of work to get it right. I think that often people in times like this, they often fall into despair, like that there is nothing that can be done. And that isn't a super helpful approach to any of this either, much like assuming that you can do everything right is not particularly helpful.
Well, here's hoping that the sort of, you know, the you know, whatever else you can say about people in tech, they work really hard, and I really and they are very smart. And to my mind, I think if we can harness some of that for the truly difficult problems of democracy in this moment, maybe that, like, I'd love to see their talent brought to bear on that, and not brought to bear on, you know, fun new drones you can fly around your house or whatever the hell else.
An AI girlfriend.
Yeah, an AI girlfriend. That's right. Paris Martineau, thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.